My name is Casey Escamilla, and I am a killer. Dun dun dun! This is a serious story time video, so that will be the last time that I use something along those lines. For the entirety of my late teen years, so about from 16, literally just after turning 16, through to 19, almost 20, I was intimately involved in 2 different wars in 2 different countries. And one of those wars was a civil war and the other was a total war. And if you just so happen not to be up to date on your war lingo, you probably aren't aware of what the difference between those 2 things are, but don't you worry, that's what I'm here for. Long story made extraordinarily bite-sized short. A civil war is about who is fighting a war, and a total war is about how the war is being fought. They can be one and the same, and they very often are, as was the case in the total war that I was involved in that it was a war that was primarily fought in one particular country and largely remained there for the entirety of the war, which made it a total civil war. But the key difference between a total war and a war of a different description is that in a total war, every single person of the nation or nations at conflict are directly involved in the war effort one way or another. There is a saying, and I think it's also a legal precedence in some parts of the world, that there are no civilians in total war. Whereas in civil war, the scope of the fighting is a lot more contained, and so outside of a few incidences of civil unrest or economic disruption, most people can just ignore it and go about their daily lives without giving a second thought to anything that's not happening directly outside their front door. I recall going to a city a few months after the start of the civil war that I was caught up in, and just being in awe at the fact that everything there was just business as usual. If you didn't know that there was a war going on in that country, just from looking at the city streets, you would have no idea whatsoever, because people just did not care. People were not aware of what was happening at all, which was a total polar opposite experience of my first war that I was caught up in, because during that war, as a total war, it didn't matter if you were in the smallest village known to mankind or the most isolated farm. Every man, his dog, his mother was directly caught up in the war effort. Both brutal wars in their own way, in different ways, but still brutal in and of themselves. On the ground experience as someone who was living through it, they were both horrific experiences. However, in saying that, the stories that I'm going to share today are all going to be from the total war, just on account of the fact that it was the first war that I experienced in my life, and so all my wartime cherries were popped in that war, and that is a terrible thing to say. That is a disgusting, terrible thing to say, but that is the reality of this video. I am going to be sharing certain stories from that first war. I got involved in the war effort very, very late in the game, extremely late in the game. I was there for less than a year, not much less than a year, but definitely less than a year until the war ended. And it had been going on for several years at this point in time, so very late in the game. I was 16, nearly 16 at the time. My birthday was in October, and we came to the war camp at the start of January. And so basically I was just like a real life romantasy character. I was 16, and well, really that's where the similarities ends. Now, what was I doing at a war camp to begin with? Well, put very simply, my mother was a very well-renowned physician, or doctor if you prefer. And prior to my birth, when my mother was younger, she had been specializing in combat medicine. And in fact, that is how my parents met in the first place, was at a border conflict. My mother was the doctor and my father was the medic, and they met and they fell in love, and I am the result of that. And huzzah, that is my life story put in motion. However, once I was born, my mother obviously stepped back from that, because a war zone is not a place for a toddler, and so she instead focused on her teaching and her research and her own clinic. She had her own clinic, and it was very successful. Well, she was very successful in everything that she did. And so for my entire childhood, we did not go to wars. Obviously, the most dangerous thing that we did is that every single summer, because I was off school and the university was out, my mother would take us down the coast to work at a mine for the entire summer, and that was a combat zone in and of itself. And I won't say that it was safe, because honestly, I once saw a man get his leg bitten off by a shark. Flash forward to my 16th birthday. It is my 16th birthday, which means that I am also only a few weeks away from finishing and graduating school. And the plan for me moving forward after finishing school is that I was going to go work with my mother full-time to study medicine, because I was raised under a different medical system than the one that you live under. And so that was the plan moving forward. And the reality of that plan is that it wasn't that big of a change for me in the first place, because I have been helping my mother in the clinic since I was like 8 years old, because we literally live at work. I was literally born at work, in that the way that our clinic was structured, and the way that all clinics were structured, is that the clinic was, it was a duplex. The clinic was on the bottom level and our house was on the top level. So there was no separation between home and work, personal life and work life. It was all one and the same thing, which definitely helps me today in the environment that I am in now. Essentially what happened is that, like I said, the country next door to the country that I'm from, they had been at war for several years at this point in time. They'd been at war for a very, very long time. The reasons of which I am acutely familiar with, but I'm not going to get into in this video, because one, they are completely and totally irrelevant to the story of me becoming a unaliver. And two, in order to do that, I would first have to completely unpack the political and spiritual system of the country, and this video would end up being like 3 hours long, and nobody wants to watch that. And so for the sake of simplicity, all you really need to know is that there are two main factions at war in this country. We're going to treat this war like it's House of the Dragon, even though the two wars are not remotely similar in any way, shape or form. But House of the Dragon season 3 comes out soon, and I'm excited for it, even though I don't like fantasy media at all. I do like House of the Dragon. And so we're just going to run with that and say that on the left we've got the Greens, and on the right we've got the Blacks. And for the record, we are in support of the Greens, even though in House of the Dragon I am a firm supporter of the Blacks. But it just makes sense in the context of this country for reasons that you don't need to know to call them the Greens and then the Blacks. So we are in support of the Greens. It is a very convoluted political system, like I said, and so I'm not going to break it down into teeny tiny pieces, because alas, again, we would be here for 4.5 hours. But what you need to know is that prior to the war breaking out, the Blacks and the Greens were both in charge of ruling the country, alongside the pinks and the purples and the golds and the reds and the blues. There were 8 fractions who were in control of running the country equally, except for the Greens were a little bit more in control of running the country, in that they were the political head of state. They were the ones who represented the country on an international level. When there was a tie break needed, their vote was the one that was the determining vote. And also, the capital of their province was the capital city of the entire country, and the Blacks didn't like that, and that is putting it very, very simply. For the reason why the war broke out, there are a lot more factors that go into it, but just to keep things easily digestible, we'll just say that the Blacks did not appreciate the Greens having that little bit more power. And so basically the Blacks ended up eradicating everybody at the major religious site and taking control of the capital, and the Greens left the capital and they went to the major religious site where everyone had been eradicated, and they are now at opposite ends of the country. We've got one over here and one over here, and everything in between them is basically just a no man's land hellscape of trench warfare, and everything downwind of them is getting pushed and pulled in both directions in a struggle for control. Flashback to me. The physician who was in charge of the Greens Medical Corps and had been for like years, even prior to the war, he was, I don't remember which one, he was either my mother's teacher previously when she was a student, or one of her early colleagues when she was doing combat. Anyway, he'd been head of their medicine for years and years and years. And he was someone that my mother had a lot of respect for. And my mother didn't respect many, many people. So she had a lot of respect for him, and he ended up having either a heart attack or a stroke. Either way, whichever one, he couldn't do his job anymore. And so he contacted my mother and asked if she would consider stepping in for him and taking over the role as their head of medicine. And my mother was like, you know what, hell yeah. Casey's finished school, I've got a lot of leave saved up because my mother never took leave for anything ever. And why not? It will be a good experience. I can come down and be your interim head of medicine while you try to figure out someone to take over the role permanently. My mother and I arrived at the Greens camp for the first time on the 20th of January. And the first time that I got caught up in any unaliving business was the 28th of May. So there was a few good solid months in between. And this camp is huge. Not physically it was a good size in and of itself, it was a good size, but there are easily 3,000 people stuffed into this camp like sardines. In the lower sections, there was a lot more people than up in the higher sections, which I will get to in a minute, why that is relevant. But there was a lot of people there, and they're all stuffed in, and then you've also got a revolving door of troops coming in and out, because the way that the war was actually structured is they would spend 2 weeks out in the field, and then they would come back to camp, and they'd spend 2 weeks there, then 2 weeks out, 2 weeks in, rinse and repeat over and over and over again for eternity. It never ended. So the camp was a pretty miserable place to be. However, in saying that, and because this is a space for honesty and nobody ever judges anybody on the internet ever, even though in hindsight, as an adult, I can appreciate that the camp was a very miserable place to be for basically everybody there. The camp for me, and this specific war in general, I quite enjoyed it. I quite enjoyed being there at this point in time, which again, I understand and appreciate how horrible that sounds, but you got to keep in mind that I joined the war very, very late in the effort, and I didn't leave camp very much. I left camp twice the entire time that I was there in any serious capacity. One was to climb up a mountain with my best friend and my future husband, and the second was to go to the capital city the night before the beginning of the end. And both those experiences, though they were horrific in their own specific way, they were not horrific in a war effort sort of way. And so my view on everything is kind of coloured by that, and I am acknowledging that here and now, because I wasn't aware that I wasn't seeing a lot of things, because I was actually leaving the camp quite often. We would go out deeper into the woods because we are at the base of the major religious site, which is a huge temple in the woods, and so we would go deeper into the woods, but there's nothing out there to see. Like, there was nothing bad out there to see, and so my experience of the war was very, very different. And even the medicine that I was practicing in this war was not, at least at the start, at the first camp that we were at, because we did move camps at a later date, which, you know, at which point we were exposed to a lot more. But at this early stage, when we were living at this first camp that we're living at, the injuries that I am being exposed to on a daily basis are being dictated by my mother, who is the head of medicine at this camp. And so she's an important official, and as a result of that, we are stationed at the command base hospital, which there are 8 different hospital bases around this camp, which with each one dealing with and specializing in a different sort of injury. So you have one base hospital that was dealing with blast injuries, and another hospital that was dealing with primarily traumatic brain injuries. And so the hospital that we were at, we specialized primarily in two areas. We specialized in infectious diseases and complex surgical cases. And naturally, on account of being a hospital base, we were also getting patients from triage. And the way that triage worked in this camp is that there was a triage tent down near the entrance gate. And so if you got sick or injured, you needed to go down there and get checked out. And then they would give you a ticket to go to a specific hospital base in order to, spread out the patients so no one is getting overwhelmed by any one thing. But for two reasons. One, because of the complex nature of the patients that we were inherently dealing with just through our specialty. And two, because we were the hospital base that was right up near the command tent, and in order to get up there, you needed to go through 8 checkpoints. Just on the basis of those two things, the patients that we were getting referred to from triage were really stupid cases, like nosebleeds and rashes and things like that. And so even that, it really diluted the way in which I viewed the war. I could never fully grasp the seriousness of what exactly was going on there, because I just did not have the capacity to fully comprehend the seriousness of what was happening, because it's just not something that I was encountering in its truest sense on a daily basis. Because in my mind, I am still a doctor. I'm a trainee doctor at a medical hospital in a war camp in the middle of a war zone. And so everything that I'm seeing is obviously the worst of the worst that there is, and it wasn't that bad. And so on my one day off, and I got one day off every single week, I would leave where I was and I would go down to the lower wards of the camp, and the lower down that you got, the more crowded it got. Because again, there were checkpoints and most people didn't have clearance to go any further than 1 or 2, maybe 3 checkpoints up. And so the lower down you got, the worse it all became. And again, in my deluded state of thinking that I am seeing everything that there is to see, I'm looking around and I'm just thinking that it is so cool and edgy down there. I loved being down there, because I am just not grasping what is going on. And if I'm not thinking that it's cool and edgy, I'm just looking at all these people and thinking that they are pathetic, because why are they so depressed and why are they crying? It's not that bad. Which don't judge me too harshly for, because then karma came and bit me square on the butt with the second war. Because in that war, I was on the total opposite foot and it was putrid. It was disgusting. It was all forms of horror. And people always ask me, why do I always tell stories about the first war and rarely tell any stories about the second war? And that is because the second war was significantly more traumatic for me personally. Despite, from a societal point of view, the second war being significantly less than the first war in every measurable sense, in that, the impact was less. It was significantly shorter, I think, from the day that it started to the day that it ended. It was about 10 months. It was a very, very short war. There were very few casualties. There was objectively a lot of casualties, but compared to the first war, I'm talking like tens of thousands less than the first war. And the economic impact was negligible. However, in saying that, even with all that in mind, from me personally having lived through it and experienced it, it was not a good time. It was so much worse than the first war. Anyway, back to the story, because I keep going off on tangents. During the events of the first war, I met my best friend, and I met my best friend in a highly unusual way. He came in with an eye injury. His eye got cut, and it got cut really, really bad. It got cut from the eyebrow down to the orbital floor. And it was objectively, in and of itself, a very bad injury. To this day, he can perceive light in the eye, but he cannot see absolutely anything. He is fully blind, 100% blind, zero perception. But that's not the reason why he got admitted to our specific hospital. No, he got admitted to our hospital because when he arrived back at camp, he had developed a full-blown infection in the eye. Just septic shock all the way through the floor. And so he came up to our hospital, and to get the eye cleaned out. And the main concern and the main reason why he was submitted to us specifically is that no one knew where he got this eye injury from. And there had been reports for about a month at this point in time that there was a specific horrific virus, that I'm not going to name here, that was making its rounds in the upper part of the country, so way up the other end of the country. And had this virus gotten out into the general camp population, it would have just absolutely devastated the entire camp. So on some level, my mother did have concerns about that, but I don't think that they were real concerns. And I will tell you why I think that. Prior to the war, my mother and my best friend's mother had met each other a couple of times. And my best friend's mother was a high-ranking official in the Greens. And my mother hated her guts, despised her, thought that she was the singular worst mother since that mother from Flowers in the Attic. And so my mother essentially just wanted to prove a point. And so she locked me and my best friend into a teeny tiny isolation room. I'm talking smaller than Harry Potter's closet levels of teeny tiny. It was so small that I could sit on my bed. We had twin beds. I could sit on my bed on one side of the room, resting my head against the wall, stretch out my legs, and kick the wall on the opposite side where my friend's bed is. And I am 5'11". My legs are not that long. My mother locks us in this room, this teeny tiny closet-sized room, together, even though at this point in time we did not know each other. We had never met once. We didn't even speak the same language. Well, we did speak the same language, but my language was not my best friend's first language, and he had even though he was, technically on paper fluent in it, he had very little experience in talking it on a day-to-day basis, and so it wasn't fantastic. She locked us in this room together for 4 entire weeks. Well, again, not the 4 entire weeks as much as she would have liked to have locked us in the room for the 4 entire weeks. But after the first couple of weeks, we started getting so bored and desperate for fresh air that we started sneaking out, and my mother was losing control of the situation. And so she started letting us leave for a few hours every day to go outside, provided that we didn't interact with a lot of people in case, my friend was still dying of this virus that he clearly didn't have, or else he would have, already deceased. May 27th. Me, my best friend, and my future husband, who for the record is only my future husband because him and my best friend were doing the dirty devil's tango, if you get my drift, but that is a different story for a completely different video. But anyway, we are not at camp. We have not been at camp the entire day. No, we are in a teeny tiny gardening shed deep in the woods with a man named Pyrrhus doing unspeakable things that went against the law of nature. And that is all you need to know on that specific topic. But for a couple of weeks at this point in time, there have been talks and discussions and acknowledgements that in the woods surrounding our camp, there are a few squadrons of enemy soldiers. But no one is concerned about this. No one is worried about this because, as horrible as that may sound to your unexperienced ears, that's just a normal thing. They know where our base is. We know where the city is, obviously. And you just don't do anything with that information because despite what you may see in popular media about war, you just don't go to your enemy's house on a random Tuesday morning and kick down their door unless there is literally no other option available to you, because their house, their base, is where they keep all their men. It's where they keep all their weaponry. So why would you want to take the fight directly there and give them the home base advantage when you don't have to? So it's basically just a reality of war that there are always going to be enemy scouts scouting the area near your base, but you're not going to be worried about that because, again, it's just a reality of war. It is late on the 26th, the evening of the 26th. It's like 9 o'clock at night. It's dark outside. And me and my best friend and Pyrrhus, we are still in this gardening shed. My husband has left like 2 hours prior, but he was supposed to come back after the fact and he just never did. And so me and my best friend, after a while, like, wow, we best leave and go find him and make sure that he hasn't, wandered off the path and been eaten by cannibals or anything. And we didn't have to walk very far to figure out that something was going down at the camp. Because first of all, we could smell it almost immediately. It was charred flesh on the air, like a really bad barbecue. And then the closer we got, it started snowing, except for it wasn't snow because it wasn't cold. In fact, it was a bit warm on account of it was ash. There was ash falling from the freaking trees. It was gross. To get back to camp, me and my best friend had to walk through this giant hedge maze because the camp is built. Well, it was set in a old crumbling village that was at the base of this temple, this giant temple that was the most spiritual religious site in the country, and it had a giant hedge maze around it, and we'd gone off in that direction, so naturally we had to walk back through the hedge maze to get back to camp. And so as we're walking and we start approaching the exit to get back into the camp itself, we start noticing that on the ground, on the floor of the maze, pushed up against the walls, are all these bodies. And they're in really terrible shape. Some of them have been burnt to a crisp, some of them are bled out, some of them are still actively in the process of dying with nobody there to comfort them, because what is happening on the other side of this hedge is just so horrific. And I can say that without a doubt, that it is. I am someone who prior to this night and after this night has seen a lot of death in my life, gruesome and otherwise, and yet this specific night is still one of the worst nights that I have ever seen. It is definitely in the top 3 worst casualty events that I have ever been around and associated with. It was a really, really bad night. It was the kind of night, and this is going to sound absolutely barbaric to say, but it's the truth. This specific event made the first 15 minutes of Saving Private Ryan look like the Yule Ball in Harry Potter. That is how bad it was. It was almost indescribable, but I'm going to try it anyway because I have colourful language. So it was just really, it was bad. It was really, really bad. I'm talking, there were disembodied limbs hanging from the trees like Christmas ornaments. There were people on fire, actively on fire. And because it's the middle of the night in the middle of the forest, sometimes when we were walking down the different tiers of the village, those people on fire were the only things that you could see. And someone, I still don't know who it was to this day because it was indiscriminate in the way that it was working. They had this kind of, I don't even know what it was, but have you ever seen the beginning of the movie Ghost Ship or the first Resident Evil movie with the wide hallway? Think of that. So anyway, long story very short, what had happened, unbeknownst to us in that moment, what had happened was just a good old-fashioned case of perfidy, which if you don't know what that is, it is the war crime of inviting confidence from your enemy that they are entitled to either your protection or protection under the laws of war. The Greens have been in these woods for years, right, at this point in time, and the woods are a shithole. They are. The camp itself is set in this abandoned, crumbling old village that, again, has been abandoned for decades upon decades upon decades at this point in time. So it is moldy, and the woods are wet, and they're muddy, and they're humid, and they're windy, and they're just generally all around not a very nice place to be. And then you add in the additional factor of there are 3,000 people in this village that is really not designed to house that many people. And suddenly it's very much not the kind of place that you want to be residing in. The people in charge of the Greens prior to the war had come from an incredibly luxurious city with all the comforts, all the trimmings, all the privileges that come with being someone on the top of the pecking order in that kind of environment. So prior to the war, they had all the best clothes, they had all the best jewelry, they had all the goose down stuffed feathered pillows that you could ever want. They ate baked Alaskas every day if that's what their hearts desired. And now they are out there in the woods in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but bugs and mud. And there is running water. There is at least that luxury, but there is no hot water. There is no this, there is no that. It is not a good place to be if you have come from the lap of luxury. These people did the very best that they could in the circumstances and the situation that they were in to replicate the level of luxury that they were accustomed to. However, there is only so much that you can do in the woods. That was the first hurdle that they had to overcome. And the second and larger hurdle that they had to overcome is that they are now in a much more visual position out there in the woods than they had been in the city. And so the very last thing that you want to do in this circumstance is you don't want to be putting on a huge luxurious display of wealth and comfort like you are residents of the capital in the Hunger Games, while you're living amongst and in view of, direct visual field of, these infantry troops who are literally risking life and limb for you. But naturally, there are always going to be a specific certain group of individuals who are not going to take well to having to live like this, despite what the consequences would be if they didn't, who are not going to appreciate the forced change in aesthetics and privilege that they are now having to sacrifice, purely, again, for aesthetics purposes, so it's not seen like, you're eating steak every day while everyone else is eating gruel. And one person in particular, the one who arguably disliked this the most, was a certain gentleman named Heston Bergadella. Now, Heston was not an aristocrat. In fact, Heston was the Greens' Lord Chamberlain. And if you don't know what a Lord Chamberlain is, a Lord Chamberlain is the senior most member of a prominent household. He is essentially the CEO of all the cleaners and the cooks and the drivers and everyone in that capacity. He is the one who is in charge of them. Now, Heston, he was an arrogant prick of the highest order. There is really no other way to describe it, so I'm just going to put it on the table. He was a horrible, horrible, horrible man. Every time that I met him, I came away feeling worse for the experience. And Heston had been the Lord Chamberlain of the leader of the Greens for years and years and years prior to the war. In fact, I think I have memories of someone telling me, in fact, probably Heston himself, that his family had been involved in service towards this specific family for generations and generations and generations. And so it was a very well-entrenched and established family affair. But like I said, Heston was a terrible person. He was a terrible, horrible man. And one of the things that made him so horrible is that he was the kind of person that believed that because he was in proximity to something, therefore he was. And so because he was in close proximity on a daily basis to the leader of the Greens, he therefore believed that him himself was an ultimate authority. So Heston hated being out in the woods, but more than he hated being out in the woods for himself, he more so hated the fact that the leader of the Greens was out in the woods. He thought that it was the worst thing to ever happen in the country's entire history. He thought it was an abomination, her being out there rubbing shoulders with the disgusting lower classes. And so his ultimate goal in life was to get her back to the city in a lap of luxury, safe from the scum of the earth, as soon as possible. And if that didn't happen, then obviously the whole entire world was going to end. What had happened in the lead up to the night of the 26th is that command knew, everybody knew, I knew from the tiny isolation room that I was confined to, that there were enemy soldiers in proximity to the camp. Everybody knew. Everybody knew that. Nobody knew exactly what they were doing out there, but nobody really cared either to know. But the war had been going on at this point in time for several years. And from what I know, from what he said after the fact, what I gather is that Heston was starting to lose faith in the fact that the war was ever going to end, that it could ever be won in any meaningful capacity, that it was just going to keep going on and on and on, as it had been going on and on for several years. But what Heston did is, in his infinite genius, his technical genius, horned over decades of service, he took it upon himself to go into the leader of the Greens camp's office, and she, like many, many leaders, had an auto signature, and he used that auto signature to write a letter to the leader of the enemy troops that are out in the woods around the camp, inviting them back to the camp under the false belief that they are being invited to initiate peace talks. But of course, he didn't tell anybody that he had done this because it would be treason, and so nobody knew that they were coming, and the next thing anybody knows, an entire enemy infantry has just showed up at the front gates of the camp talking nonsense, and there's a lot of confusion about what's happening and what's going on because nobody has been informed that we are expecting these people, these enemies, to show up at our gate acting all chummy and friendly, and the command tent is all the way up the other end of the camp through 8 checkpoints, so it's not as easy as just running up there and, you know, checking what's going on. And so the situation very rapidly deteriorated into what occurred on the night. And I don't recall exactly how many people died that night, but I feel like it was in the high 200s. Either way, it was a lot of people, and so people were pissed off. And then somehow over the course of the next 5 to 6 hours, it somehow got out that Histon was directly and personally responsible for inviting the blacks to the camp, and so everybody then became righteously pissed off. Flash forward to the morning of the 27th. It's like 6:37 a.m. in the morning, and I'm walking with my best friend up to the command tent because we are going to meet his mother. And at this point in time, Histon is already under arrest. He's being held on remand in the command tent, and somehow this has gotten out to the general population, and so people are breaking through the checkpoints and they are rushing the command tent because someone somewhere along the lines has started a rumor that because of who he is, the command is going to pardon him, essentially, and try to sweep the whole thing under the rug, which was completely and totally ridiculous if you think about it, because at this point in time, like 6-7 hours have passed since the entire thing happened, so they were still in the very early stages of what they were planning to do. They had no solid plan on what they were going to do, but people didn't care. People could not be reasoned with. They wanted the man's head. And a wartime military camp is nothing like the real world. You do not have the privilege of time to conduct an investigation and do interviews and draw a conclusion about the who, what, when, why, and how of what happened. No, you do not have time to do that because the threat of mutiny is a hell of a lot faster than due process. When an army loses hundreds of its own in a single night due to internal incompetence, the chain of command hangs on by a single thread. You need to move quickly and you need to move with competence, because when things spiral out of control in that kind of environment, which is a high pressure environment, they spiral fast. And if you stand between the troops and what they want, they will have no hesitation, regardless of who you are and how much control you think you have. They will have no hesitation in taking your head before taking what they want as well. And so in these kind of situations, you don't have the privilege of time. You need to move quickly and you need to be fully transparent about what you're doing and why you're doing it. But anyway, me and my best friend, we go up to the command tent to meet with his mother. And his mother was already there with another commander, and they were bickering with one another, but they stopped pretty much as soon as we came up because me and my best friend were in a lot of trouble because my mother had discharged my best friend a couple of days prior to what happened. And so he was supposed to go home that night, but he ended up sleeping at my hospital with me and my husband, and so he didn't go home. And so his mother had no idea where he was or what had happened or what was going on, or even if he was still alive after, the night of a massacre. And so she was really, really pissed off. And so me and my best friend are in the midst of getting chewed out by his mother for being inconsiderate when the actual leader of the Green comes out and joins the conversation. And she's polite. She's always perfectly polite. And, She asks us how we're doing, how we will blah, 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 all the niceties. But after all that's said and done, she pretty much dismisses us and tells us, thanks, but no thanks, you can go now. And I was perfectly happy to, go. But no, my best friend's mother told her that she wanted both me and my best friend to come along with them. And I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean that I need to come along to whatever this is? I have nothing to do with whatever this is. But there was nothing I could say or do about it, because at this point in time, my best friend's mother has my arm in a death grip and is dragging me along into the depths of the command tent, which to me looked like the gates of hell. So they go down and they start interviewing Heston about why he did what he did. And it's all very emotional. There's tears, there's hugging, there's crying. Everyone is very, it's a very intense moment for everyone who is not me, because in that moment, the only thing I'm thinking is, why the hell am I here? What does this have to do with me? I barely know the man. I've spoken to him like 4 times in my entire life, and none of those experiences have been pleasant. I don't know why my presence is required here. So it takes about 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, the leader of the Greens, she decides that ultimately justice needs to be transparent in order to preserve the chain of command. And so Heston's got to go off with his head. Like, not literally off with his head, because that is, I don't know. Is that something that people do? I don't know. But more like with his head. And the leader of the Greens, she is genuinely distraught at this decision, but it's a decision that she has to make. But it's a very sad one for her, which is understandable because Heston's been taking care of her entire life. And so she makes a decision and then she leaves in tears. And I was like, you know what? I think I am going to follow her lead. I'm going to leave now because this has nothing to do with me, and I am going to follow her and make sure that she is okay. But no, again, my best friend's mother grabs me by the arm and doesn't let me go. And she leans in and she says to me that if I leave this room before she grants me permission, then she is going to make sure that I never see my best friend ever again. And so I had no choice but to stay in the friggin' room and watch the whole thing go down. At this point in time, Heston is no longer amongst the land of the living, and my best friend's mother tells me to leave, but not for good. Oh no, that would be too simple. Instead, she tells me to go upstairs and get a tarp and bring it back downstairs, and then we can get to work. And that is exactly what happened. I went and I got the tarp and I brought it back downstairs, and then we started quartering up the goods, which is not standard practice in these kind of cases. As an adult, I understand that this was a big show and dance entirely for my benefit, but at the time I really didn't understand what the hell was going on, and so I just went along with it. I think that my friend's mum was trying to, I don't know what she was trying to do, but whatever she was trying to do, I think she overlooked the fact that, I was a trainee doctor who was very well acquainted with bodily fluids and anatomy, and had seen different anatomy in different formats my entire life. And so the whole entire thing wasn't as, warding off my best friend as I think she was kind of hoping that it would be. That was my first ever encounter, my first up and close personal encounter with unaliving. And of course, the story of me being the one wielding the blade for the first time is a completely different story that I was planning on telling tonight, but it's really cold and really late. But I don't know. I can tell it. I will tell it. But I'm not going to do the whole details thing. I'm just going to tell it in its state, and if there are details missing, there are details missing. November 16th, specifically. So it was several months after the whole Heston fiasco. And me and my best friend, we were in the city, the capital city. It was still occupied at that point in time. Not much longer, but it was technically still occupied on that specific night. And the reason we were there are very, very complicated and rooted in politics, and so I'm not going to get too far into it. Just know that the adults were not happy that we were there. Like, we're not happy. My mother was not happy. His mother was not happy, but there wasn't really anything that they could do to prevent it. The point was they weren't happy about me and my best friend being in the city, and they were planning on sending people. They were planning on sending 3 people to the city that specific night. That turned into 6 people because me and my best friend went with them, and the adults weren't happy about that, and so they sent my best friend's cousin to babysit us. However, one of the other people that they were going to send was Dreslevek, my old friend Dreslevek, and if you have watched my videos before, then you're up to date on that, and if you haven't, well, go watch another video. But they had sent him up, and by the time that we exited the fountain, me, my best friend, and his cousin were supposed to go in one direction, and then Dreslevek and the other 2 were supposed to go in the other direction, but the other 2 were like, we ain't going with him, he's crazy, we're not going with him. And so I had no problem going with Dreslevek. And so me, my best friend, and Dreslevek went in one direction. We had to walk down to the end of the city. That took us about almost 3 hours. It was daylight when we arrived, like when we left, we arrived in the city. By the time we got down there, it was nighttime. Dreslevek helped us with the first one, and then he was like, I have to go and do whatever I have to do. And so you 2 are going to have to go and do this other one by yourselves. It'll be a really easy one. I will draw you a map. I will give you instructions. Just follow that. You'll be fine. And so that is what we did. We parted ways with Dress, and he went one direction and we went the other direction. And we followed his map to where he told us to go. Reasons I'm not going to get into, but we had shed our uniform, which makes this perfidy as well, I think, technically speaking, but I will get to that in a minute. There was like one of the blacks men who was patrolling a certain street that we needed to go down, which we could go down easily, I guess, technically. I don't know. But my best friend was like, let's leave him and we will go around a different way. I'm like, I don't want to go around a different way because it will add another hour to our path. And I want to get this over done and quickly so we can go back up into the fountain and meet the others. And I was like, it'll be easy. We can just, and then go about our way because you are allowed. But my best friend was like, no, I don't want to do it because I've already done like 3 tonight and I don't feel like doing another one. I was like, well, it's easy for us. And he's like, there is no us. You don't do anything. I do it all and I'm not in the mood. I was like, fine. If you're going to be that way, I will do it. And so I did do it. But basically, if you are a combatant in a big conflict, a couple of days after the conflict, you will receive a form. It's called a casualty return form. And the point of the casualty return form is that you need to sit down and you need to write the who, what, when, where, and how of everyone that you've or seriously maimed during the events of the conflict. And then you send it back and they will read through it, and then they feel if, they need to, they will send someone out to interview you to see if any crimes have been committed. They also use the form for as a play-by-play to see where everyone was at any given point in time. So, if there is an obvious crime that's being committed during the events, they can try to pinpoint exactly who was in that area at the time and likely responsible for it. But no, I sent mine back, and then that was that. They came and they interviewed me for about 7 minutes and then they left, and that was the end of that. We never heard anything back from it ever again. So yeah, that is my first. And you're probably thinking, Casey, I thought people weren't supposed to talk about what happened at war after war. And you're absolutely right. I have never spoken about this to anybody who was not in the room where it happened before. And this is the first time they're doing it. And why am I doing it? Well, frankly, because if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that historically I have had to go to Melbourne every 3 months, like clockwork, to talk to some fancy people about some fancy things. For the last 3 times that I was supposed to do it, I've refused to go because Dreslevek made the very good point of what are they going to do if I don't go, and also they don't make it easy for me to go. And I, around the same time that I had that conversation with Dreslevek, found out that they have ways of making it easier for me, and they just refuse to do it. And so I'm like, I'm not going anymore. However, as it currently stands, Nate, Ash, and I, we want to go to New Zealand at some point in the forthcoming months, just for a break, just because to get out of the friggin' outback and away from Australia for a little while and just, you know, something different, some new horizons to see. Not far. Basically, I think Nate just wants to go to Denny's. To be honest, I think he just wants to go to Denny's Pancakes. And we don't have that in Australia, but they have it in New Zealand. And so the plan is that we're going to go to New Zealand to get Denny's and also look at the live lobster cages that they have in their supermarkets and their orcas as well, because they have a more reliable orca population than we do. And again, if you watch my channel before, you know that Nate and I are in the midst of a partnership with SeaWorld in which we are developing a prototype device for interspecies communication with a specific emphasis on orcas and the way that they developed language. Anyway, so we want to go to New Zealand, but in order for me to go to New Zealand, because I'm a stateless individual, I need to get permission from my handlers, but they were refusing to do it. And so there was a lot of back and forth for a little while, and we finally came to the mutual conclusion, the mutual agreement that if I were to go to Melbourne for the weekend, which was last weekend, they would sign the forms and I would be able to go to New Zealand for 5 days. 5 days only, which is fine. I think that we can see everything and eat everything that we want to eat in New Zealand in 5 days. But in order to do that, I had to go to Melbourne for a little while. One of the people that they had me speak to this time was a psychologist lady who had flown in from America. And I'd never met her before. I'd never met her before because a lot of the people that I see at these meetings time and time again tend to be the same people. Never met this lady before. She came in, she was bright, she was cheerful, she was doing a PhD on mental injuries after war. Fine, whatever. I feel like that's a wasted space in my limited time slot that people get, but if that's what they want to schedule in, then go ahead. No problem. I feel like you can get that information from someone who's not me, but whatever. It's their circus, it's their monkeys, they can do what they want. And so she came in and she started asking really intrusive questions about things that had happened, which I like to call the true crime syndrome, in that there is a certain demographic of people, primarily women, who once they get caught up into true crime nonsense, they kind of lose sight on what is an appropriate thing to talk about and what is intrusive. Like, it's almost as if they feel like they can't get a full picture of what happened unless they have minute details on what happened. And that's the kind of thing that she was getting at. And so I wasn't giving her a lot. And she wasn't happy. She just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And when it became clear that I wasn't receptive to it because I don't care, so she wasn't pleased that I wasn't answering the questions with as much detail as she would have preferred. And so she started like trying to mind game me, meta game me a little bit. And that she started accusing me of being guilty and feelings of guilt, and that's why I was refusing to answer her questions. And she understands that because she's spoken to a lot of people in my position before, and it might help relieve some of that guilt and shame if I would just engage with her a little bit more receptively. I'm like, bitch, you are barking up the complete wrong tree here. I have no shame. I feel guilty about nothing that I have ever done ever in my entire life. I sleep perfectly fine at night. And if I had to, I would do every single one of the things that I have done in my entire life again, without hesitation. Okay? There is zero guilt going on here in this head. I don't care about what I did. I feel nothing. It did not have the impact that you clearly think that it was supposed to have on me, because I think about them never, ever. I don't know what you want me to say. I do not care. It's not guilt. It's not shame. It's just strictly no one else's business, to be frank. So she wouldn't give up, so here I am. You want to know my friggin' business? If you want it all laid out on the friggin' table in minute friggin' detail, here you go. Here's a friggin' video outlining everything that I have ever friggin' done. Well, not everything, because that video would be like 30 hours long. But the beginning of my journey, there you go. Have fun. Take it to your little research studies. I don't care. You don't even have to credit me. Just leave me alone. This is why I don't like to go to these stupid things. It's the same shit over and over and over again. They want what they want and they never appreciate what you give them. What you give them is never enough. It's just take. And what do I get in return? I work 80 hours a week in a job, which is fine. The job itself is fine. In a town that I don't want to be in. I don't have will to leave. I don't have the freedom to leave whenever I want. I have to pay 70% flat tax rate. No, like, go away. What you're giving me in return for what I'm giving you is not an equal trade-off. What are you going to do? Are you going to kick me out of my house? Is that the big grand plan if I don't answer all your questions promptly when you want to? Well, you know what? Go ahead. Kick me out of my freaking house. I do not care. I will go live with Nate in his stupid van and try to wear him down because Lord knows he has $42 million in his bank account that he refuses to touch. So that's annoying too. Not that I'm entitled to his money, but you know, we could be living a better life than we're living out here, but he's just won't do it. That is my stance. That is my conclusion. And that is my video. So it's Casey signing off for the night. As always, stay weird out there, stay safe, and have a productive evening. Good night.